Um, Mark is one of those people who say needs no introduction, but I'm well aware that some people don't know who Mark is, so I'll explain. Mark Roberts has been living in and around Florence for the last 40 or 50 years, was 40 years working here at the British Institute. We were good friends 45 years ago when I came down to Florence to teach English, and Mark just started out as a librarian. And so when I came back to be the director 40 years later, he was still here, and it was great. He was the librarian for a long time and used to program the Wednesday lecture series and all the rest of it. In his spare time, he's done a lot of research into the stories of the English colony at Florence from the days of the Grand Tour right through to the end of the 20th century. He's a good close friend and associate of Lord Harold Acton, for example, and many other people of that time. And now he's written a book all about it, which is we're going to discuss when he comes back on the 13th. But tonight he's talking about Vernon Lee and the efforts to preserve Old Florence. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Very nice to see so many people. Thank you for coming, those of you in the room and those of you on Zoom. And thank you, Simon, for your introduction and also for suggesting the title of this, the subject of this talk. This is the story of how Florence, in the later 19th century, committed a monstrous act of self-mutilation, and of how an association was formed to ensure that no further irresponsible demolitions took place. The English champion of this association was the Florence-based writer Violet Paget, known as Vernon Lee, 1856 to 1935. From February 1865 until February 1873, Florence was the capital of Italy. Before that honor was transferred to Rome. The process of absorption of the Tuscan Grand Duchy into the nascent Italian state had begun with the secret Treaty of Florence in 1844 and had culminated on 21st July 1859 when the increasingly unpopular Grand Duke Leopoldo II, seen on the left, abdicated early in the morning and fled the city never to return, so that it was said that at 6 a.m. the revolution went to breakfast. Following the September Convention of 1864 with Napoleon III, who you see in the middle, the Italian government of the conservative Marco Minghetti on the right decided to transfer the capital of the kingdom from Turin to a city somewhat nearer to the eventual objective of Papal Rome. The government was expecting the outbreak of the Third War of Independence against the Austrian Empire, which took place in 1866, and the eventuality of incorporating the Eternal City into the new kingdom. An alternative possibility, Naples, was considered and rejected, and so the election fell on Florence. The date of 3rd of February 1865 was chosen at random because the fat mustachioed king, Vittorio Emanuele, wanted to get a move on, having been annoyed by public protests in Turin, in which 52 people perished and 187 were wounded. He traveled by train via Piacenza and Bologna, the final tract being the newly completed Ferrovia Porrettana. In Florence, he tenderly embraced the aged and now blind Senator Gino Capponi and was greeted by adoring crowds. In the evening, the carriages of the royal cortege made their way by torchlight to Palazzo Pitti, where the sovereign had decided to set up his residence in the long enfilade of rooms on the Piano Nobile that is now known as the Appartamenti Reali. His consort, Maria Adelaide of Austria, had died in 1855, and Vittorio Emanuele was accompanied to Florence by his plump and placid mistress, Rosa Vercellana, La Belle Rosine, who would later become his morganatic wife. No sooner had Florence been made capital than the rather sleepy provincial town, unchanged for centuries, with its 4 bridges and its circuit of medieval walls, was galvanized into action as though hit by a strong electric current. Huge numbers of civil servants descended on Florence from Turin, and the price of accommodation skyrocketed. The Florentine architect Giuseppe Poggi produced his plan for the risanamento, a word usually translated as renovation or rehabilitation. And he handed it in on the 18th of February, 1865. The inspiration for Poggi's scheme of renewal and that of the various schemes implemented in other Italian cities, such as Milan and Naples, was the drastic renovation of the city of Paris, operated from 1853 by Georges Eugène Haussmann for the French Emperor Napoleon III. Haussmann ripped up medieval Paris and replaced it with what we see now. He demolished the overcrowded and unhygienic city center, carving out wide tree-lined boulevards, creating new parks and squares, and annexing the outlying suburbs, which was divided into many communes. In the painting on the right by Adolphe Yvon, Haussmann presents the documents for the annexation to the emperor. The number of arrondissements was thereby increased from 12 to 20, the present number. Haussmann's work met with fierce opposition, and eventually, in 1870, Napoleon had to ask him to resign. He refused and was fired, but work on his projects continued until 1927. He's usually known as Baron Haussmann, though it turns out that his barony, like that of Sir Harold Acton, was self-awarded. There can be no doubt that renovation was needed. In 1845, the reformer and utopian socialist Victor Considerant wrote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery, pestilence, and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place, where plants shrivel and perish, and where of 7 small infants, 4 die during the course of the year." Yet the sheer scale of the public works carried out by Haussmann, turning the entire city into a building site for years on end, made some people queasy and restless. The civil servant and historian Léon Halévy wrote in 1867, "The work of Monsieur Haussmann is incomparable. Everyone agrees. Paris is a marvel, and Monsieur Haussmann has done in 15 years what a century could not have done. But that's enough for the moment. There will be a 20th century. Let's leave something for them to do." Camille Pissarro painted this picture of the Avenue d'Opéra in 1892. The Goncourt brothers condemned the brutal avenues cut through the old streets as though with a saber, to the point where one could no longer feel the world of Balzac. The architect's most vocal critic in Parliament was Jules Ferry, who had ridiculed his accounting practices as les contes fantastiques d'Haussmann. Ferry wrote, "We weep with our eyes full of tears for the old Paris, the Paris of Voltaire, of Desmoulins, the Paris of 1830 and 1848, when we see the grand and intolerable new buildings, the costly confusion, the triumphant vulgarity, the awful materialism that we are going to pass on to our descendants." Some conspiratorially minded people said that the real reason for the wide avenues was to facilitate the movement of troops in the case of street fighting. And Haussmann made no attempt to deny this or to conceal the military advantages of his scheme. So the Risanamento di Firenze began in 1865 and lasted for some 30 years, bringing in its wake destruction on a massive scale. As in Paris, a necessary preliminary step was to expand the city by incorporating the adjacent communes. But this proved more complicated than had at first been thought. 6 communes bordered Florence: Rovezzano, Bagnaripoli, Galluzzo, Legnaia, Pellegrino, and Fiesole, of which one, Bagnaripoli, stretched far away into the Chianti, and another, Fiesole, was of immense historical importance, and indeed was far older than Florence. A series of compromises was reached. This is the original version of Poggi's plan, which he presented on the 18th of February, 1865. Look at him sitting comfortably and complacently in his carved wooden chair. His plan was intended to deal with the following matters: to supply sufficient accommodation for all those civil servants, parliamentary deputies, senators, and government officials from Turin, to harmonize public and private interests while reducing speculation to a minimum, to defend the city from the Arno bursting its banks, as it had done in 1864 and even more disastrously in 1844, to confer on Florence a celebratory, modern, and bourgeois appearance in line with other European capitals, especially Paris, to demolish the old city walls, at any rate those on the north bank of the Arno, in order to construct the new viali, or boulevards, to lay out the scenic Viale dei Colli on the south bank of the river, to create the Campo di Marte as a parade ground for military maneuvers, to make a new railway station, to build a new slaughterhouse, and to install hydraulic defenses. Work began in May 1865 and lasted some 5 years. A massive program of expropriation was required, what the Americans call eminent domain. Amid the welter of destruction, Poggi had at least the good sense to leave the vast majority of the city gates standing, and outside of them, he created elegant and rationally planned piazzas. One of the most admired and least controversial features of Poggi's scheme was the Viale dei Colli on the south side of the Arno, winding its way scenographically from Porta Romana as far as what became Piazzale Michelangelo, and thence on to the Ponte San Nicolò. The idea was that carriages would process along this viale on warm summer evenings, affording their passengers breathtaking views of the Duomo and of the other city monuments. Work lasted from 1865 to 1868. After the elections on 22nd of October, the new parliament met on 8th November 1865 in the Salone del Cinquecento inside Palazzo Vecchio. The parliamentary chamber, planned 375 years previously by Savonarola for his super-democratic constitution. On the right, a marvelous anonymous evocation of a concert held there in Grand Ducal times. If you should ever feel the need for a 19th century style breakfast setting, I recommend the breakfast room at the Hotel Bernini in Piazza San Firenze, which is decorated with frescoed busts of all the eminent national and Florentine politicians of this period, painted at the time in lively style. You do not have to book, but you should not turn up before 10 o'clock, unless, of course, you're staying in the hotel. In order to prepare for the destruction of the Mercato Vecchio that stood next to the Jewish ghetto, in the early 1870s, a gleaming new meat, fish, and vegetable market was constructed at San Lorenzo, made of wrought iron, cast iron, and glass, by Giuseppe Mengoni, the architect of the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II in Milan. It was inaugurated in 1874, so that's just 150 years ago. And this summer, there are all sorts of events planned to celebrate 150 years of the San Lorenzo market. The site had been chosen 10 years previously by Giuseppe Poggi in the slummy area known as Camaldoli di San Lorenzo. The new market was bound by Via dell'Ariento, Via Panicale, Via Chiara, and Via Sant'Antonino, and the houses that had to be demolished were all working class dwellings, and apparently for this reason, the demolitions aroused little or no opposition. This was not the case with some of the old churches that had to come down. My first example is the ancient church of Santa Maria degli Ughi. It seems to have been founded in the 9th century by the Ughi family, who were of Longobarд origin, and it was anciently known as Prima Rama, inasmuch as it was the very first Florentine church to be dedicated to the Virgin Mother of God. The earliest documentary reference is from the year 1153. It stood near what is now Palazzo Strozzi, not far from the Vallombrosan Church of Santa Trinita, whose clergy appear to have taken an interest in it. The church bell of Santa Maria degli Ughi enjoyed special privileges, and on Holy Saturday, it was always rung before any other bell in the city. On the right, we see a holy water stoup from this church bearing the Strozzi arms, now in the Museo Bardini. In the late 15th century, the nave and facade were renewed at the expense of the Strozzi family. The church was suppressed under Pietro Leopoldo in 1785 and became a private oratory. Santa Maria degli Ughi was demolished in 1890. Another interesting old church, yes, first documented in 1180, was San Tommaso, that stood near the Mercato Vecchio in Via Succhialinae, now Via Roma, on the site of what is now the Savoy Hotel. The drawing at lower right is from the Codex Rustici, and it dates from around 1450. San Tommaso was a market church frequented by stallholders and their customers. The building seen to the right of the church was originally the canonica or priest's house, much transformed over the centuries and adapted for civic habitation. Above the lateral door was a beautiful Romanesque relief shown at lower left, with the crucifixion between two seraphim. The church of San Tommaso was destroyed in 1888 to 89, together with other buildings associated with the Mercato Vecchio. And I should perhaps say a little about this Old Market. The Mercato Vecchio, or Old Market, stood just next to the Jewish ghetto of Florence, which had been set up in 1570 by Cosimo I de' Medici and had been doubled in size in the early 18th century by Cosimo III. The piazza was located at the intersection of the Cardo and the Decumanus of Roman Florence and was the fulcrum of the small civic center. It was officially constituted as a market around the year 1000. The daily arrival of fresh provisions made the Mercato Vecchio the noble garden of Florence, as it was called by Antonio Pucci in the 15th century. But from the Middle Ages onwards, it had its fair share of problems in the form of overcrowding, poor hygiene, criminality, and conflicts over the use of space, typical of market areas. This 18th century copy, after a lost 17th century original by Filippo Napolitano, shows the column of abundance on the left and the gibbet for the torture of the cord on the right. The beccaria, or meat market, looms in the center, while Vasari's fish market, designed in 1568 to 69 and re-erected in the 1950s in Piazza dei Ciompi, can be glimpsed in the background. That's to the left, of, between the column of abundance and the beccaria. This painting, one version of which dates from the early 1860s, is by the Florentine artist Giuseppe Morici, one of the painters who used to hang out at the Cafe Michelangelo. It's a superb evocation of the poetical charm of the Mercato Vecchio on the eve of its destruction during the Risanamento. I'm very fond of this picture, and I think it would make a very good jigsaw puzzle. Here is the old church of Sant'Andrea all'Arco, dating from the early 9th century. It was located at the southeast corner of the piazza, near the corner with Via Calimala in Piazza Sant'Andrea. In 852, Louis II, King of Italy, donated it to the Bishop Radingo so that he could set up a female monastery dedicated to the Blessed Virgin. He did so and appointed as abbess his own sister, Radburga. A document from the year 1013 implies that it got its name from its proximity to a Roman arch. In the 15th century, the high altar was adorned by an altarpiece traditionally thought to have been by Ghirlandaio, but now known to be by Cosimo Rosselli, seen at lower right. It shows the Madonna and Child surrounded by St. Andrew, the Baptist, St. Zenobius, and St. Reparata. The parish was suppressed in 1785, and a confraternity used the building for meetings. It was pulled down in 1889. Next to the church in Piazza Sant'Andrea stood the lovely Tabernacolo dei Linaioli, designed by Lorenzo Ghiberti, and with a painting of the Madonna and Child by Fra Angelico. It was commissioned in 1432 and is now in the Museo di San Marco. Apart from the Linaioli, several other guilds had their headquarters in the old market, such as the Medici e Speziali, the Albergatori, the Rigattieri, the Oleandoli e Pizzicagnoli. All of these historic buildings were destroyed. This is the very ancient church of San Miniato fra le Torri, which stood on the site of the present post office. It is said to have marked the place where the Armenian protomartyr of Florence, St. Miniatus or Minius, was beheaded in the time of the Emperor Decius. You will remember that he carried his own severed head up the hillside to the site of the more famous church of San Miniato al Monte. In the 15th century, the high altar was adorned by an altarpiece by Andrea Castagno, now in the Berlin Gemäldegalerie, showing the Assumption between the cephalophoric St. Miniatus and St. Julian, repentant murderer of his own parents. The church was deconsecrated in 1785 under Pietro Leopoldo and was turned over to civic habitation. The building was demolished in 1894. The church of Santa Maria in Campidoglio stood at the edge of the Mercato Vecchio in what is now Via Brunelleschi, more or less on the site of the Gambrinus beer hall, now the Hard Rock Cafe. One of the oldest churches within the city walls. It owed its name to the fact of its being built next to the Capitoline Temple in the Roman Forum of Florencia. Legend would have it founded by Charlemagne, but the earliest documentary references date from 1179, when an agreement concerning it was stipulated between several families living in the area. In two contracts of 1190 and 1201, the church is also referred to as Santa Maria Podagetria, the Greek term for she who indicates the way, intended here as protectress of wayfarers. The great Renaissance artist Antonio del Pollaiuolo was possibly buried in this church, though some say his grave is in Rome, where he died. Like several other small churches in this area, it was suppressed and deconsecrated in 1785 under Pietro Leopoldo. In the black and white photograph, you see it transformed into a civic habitation. The building was demolished in 1890. The church of San Pier Buonconsiglio, dated from the 8th century, being probably built after 780 onto an exhedra in the old Roman Forum. From the nearby Capitoline Temple, it was variously known as Ecclesia ad Forum Regis or as San Piero in Palco de Foro Veteri. The earliest documentary reference is from 1198, when a group of citizens from the Sestieri di San Pancrazio took an oath there to the Lega di Tuscia. In the 15th century, a fine glazed terracotta relief of the Madonna and Child by Luca della Robbia was installed. It is now in the Palazzo di Parte Guelfa. San Pier Buonconsiglio was demolished in 1890. One church that was not saved by the self-appointed protectors of old Florence, although it lasted until after their appearance, was the ancient one of San Leo, in what is now Via Brunelleschi. Leo is a corruption of the more usual Leone. It was not demolished until 1901, the year that Giuseppe Poggi died. On the left, we see a drawing of it from the mid-15th century Codex Rustici. It is recorded in the Codex Bullettoni of 1013 in a document of the Florentine chapter dated 1051 and in another of 1233 that specifies the parochial boundaries with the church of Santa Maria Maggiore. The fine altarpiece by Giovanni Fei of 1394 happily survived and is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Giovanni was known as Nanni, and he married a wife called Nanna. The photograph on the right shows the church isolated after the destruction of the ghetto. You'll be glad to hear this is the last of the churches. My eighth and final example of an ancient church destroyed during the Risanamento is San Donato dei Vecchietti, one of the many Tuscan churches dedicated to St. Donatus. It stood next to Palazzo Vecchietti, which happily still survives on the corner between Via dei Vecchietti and Via dei Strozzi, and is occupied by the Deutsche Bank. The church is first mentioned in 1067 as San Donato in Versailles, suggesting that there were orchards and kitchen gardens in the locality, but a capitular document of 1275 refers to it as San Donato dei Vecchis, indicating that by that date its patronage had already been acquired by the Vecchietti family. They embellished it several times in the Middle Ages and gave it a major restoration between 1584 and 1590 at the hands of their young Flemish protege, Jean de Boulogne, known as Giambologna. It was restored again in 1708 before being suppressed in 1785. The photo from the 1880s shows it transformed into a civic residence. The fine altarpiece of the Adoration of the Magi by Santi di Tito, signed and dated 1596, was thought lost, but turned up outside Krakow in Poland, where it was identified in the 1980s thanks to the ermine collar worn by the leading Magus. The Vecchietti coat of arms is azure with 5 ermines, argent. The church of San Donato dei Vecchietti was demolished in 1892. In May 1881, the last Jewish family left its apartment in the Florence ghetto, thus marking the end of a segregation that had lasted over 300 years. In the early 1880s, the journalist Giulio Piccini, who wrote under the pseudonym of Yarrow, for reasons best known to himself, began writing a series of lurid articles denouncing in the most violent terms the disgusting and revolting living conditions of the old market and the now empty ghetto. Yarrow's horrid descriptions were collected into a book published in 1881 under the title Firenze Sotterranea. It proved extremely popular and went through several editions. It was a clarion call for demolition. On the left, we see the column of abundance in about 1881, as we saw it in the painting by Giuseppe Morici, covered with masonry to about 1/3 of its height. In the middle, it is shown about 7 years later, after extensive destruction, although Vasari's fish lodger can still be seen in the background. On the right, an early 20th century photo of Yarrow. Now, at last, we come to our leading lady. Vernon Lee, real name Violet Paget, 1856 to 1935, was born at Chateau Saint-Léonard near Boulogne, the only child of her mother's second marriage. Her rich parents led a nomadic and cosmopolitan life. Violet's first 5 years were spent almost entirely in Germany, at Frankfurt, Baden, Wiesbaden, and Kissingen, and she seems not to have visited England until 1862, when the family spent the summer on the Isle of Wight. Between the ages of 10 and 17, Violet lived at Thun in the canton of Bern in Switzerland, in Nice, and in Rome. In the latter city, which she at first disliked, she caught a glimpse of Pope Pius IX's Mastai Ferretti. The quavering notes of singers, the shrill blasts of trumpets, and there became visible, moving above the heads, above the sheen of the bayonets and the halberds, the great fans of ostrich feathers, the golden tassels and the gently swaying throne, the white splendor of the pontifical robes and jewels. From that moment, everything seemed changed. I was wild to be taken to all the ruins, where among the vine roots and the dry thistle flowers. I hunted for bits of porphyry and giallo antico, for scraps of scarlet and blue plaster hidden under the rubbish and weeds. I was wild to be taken into those dark, damp little churches. Rome had seized her imagination. Her wandering life ended in 1873 when she settled in Florence with her parents at number 12 Via Solferino. In 1882, the Paget family moved from the bourgeois Via Solferino to the equally bourgeois Via Garibaldi. Here is a description by Violet's intimate friend, Mary Robinson, seen on the left, of the former house, which looked onto the canalized Mugnone. The Arno was a stone's throw to the south, and the trees of the Cascine rustled at the end of the little street. Although it was long ago, the thinnest of veils divides me from that September afternoon in 1880. I can see the cool north light of that lofty Florentine room, and behind the crimson satin hangings, the high, tall windows. I can see the shining floor of polished scagliola, the roses in quaint old painted pots. This was the background. In front sat a girl, a few months older than myself, about 23. She had soft blonde hair, benignant gray-green eyes, which gleamed through a pair of huge, round 18th century goggles. She looked at once audacious, refined, argumentative, and shy. This young lady was Miss Paget. There was certainly no more delightful house to stay in than Casa Paget. From March 1889 until her death in 1935, with a short interruption during the First World War, Violet lived at Villa Il Palmerino in the valley of the Africo at Maiano. She bought it in 1906. A square 15th century building, it had once belonged to Ottaviano, the brother of the celebrated sculptor Agostino di Duccio. It was surrounded by vineyards and olive groves and could only be reached by a series of narrow, winding lanes. Like Boccaccio's Young People Escaping the Plague, the Paget family moved to Il Palmerino in 1889, partly to avoid an epidemic of cholera. When Vernon Lee died in 1935, Il Palmerino was bought by the painter Federico Angeli and his wife, the poet and painter Lola Costa. I made friends with Lola Costa, who lived to be 103. And naturally, I questioned her about Vernon Lee, but unfortunately, they never met. Here is Lola's self-portrait and one of her gardens. Towards the end of her long life, she arranged for Vernon Lee's thitherto unmarked grave at the Alluri Cemetery to be properly inscribed. It now reads, Violet Paget, 1856 to 1935, Vernon Lee writer. She honored Italy and loved Florence. I well remember the ceremony. From her time in Nice, Violet was an intimate childhood friend of the great American artist John Singer Sargent, who painted this magnificent portrait of her in 1881 and later sketched her androgynous likeness, which you can see on the left. She wrote her first book aged 16 or 17, and a very brilliant one it was, on Italian music and literature in the 18th century. In 1893, Henry James wrote from London to his brother William in Florence, a word of warning about Vernon Lee, because she is as dangerous and uncanny as she is intelligent, which is saying a great deal. She is by far away the most able mind in Florence. Virginia Woolf wrote approvingly, she picks her feet up. After years of neglect, Vernon Lee's literary reputation is now steadily rising, and each year sees conferences and seminars devoted to her work. The principal themes of her writings are hauntings, aesthetics, empathy, a concept that she introduced to the English-speaking world, derived from the German notion of Einfühlung, and genius loci, or spirit of place. Vernon Lee was a pacifist, but also a polemicist, and she would have agreed that the pen is mightier than the sword. This phrase was first formulated by Edward Bulwer-Lytton in his play about Richelieu, but the notion goes back to antiquity. Hamlet says that many wearing rapiers are afraid of goose quills. Feeling that her beloved Florence was threatened with modernization, Vernon Lee jumped into action. On 15th of October 1898, she wrote to friends in the United States, Annie Fields and her partner Sarah Orme Jewett, urging them to get as many anybody's signatures as possible by December. The only hope of stopping the now systematic destruction and rebuilding of Florence is to convince the shop and hotel keepers, etc., that foreigners, so far from being attracted to a modernized Florence, will cease to come to it. She herself rushed round the city, posting flyers in hotels and banks, convinced that we must threaten the pockets of the bourgeoisie by showing the disapprobation of foreigners. Just 2 months later, on the 15th December 1898, the Times of London published a long letter from Vernon Lee about the sventramento, or disemboweling, of the city centre, the old market and the Jewish ghetto. The centre of Florence, she wrote, including the old marketplace, Vasari's fish market, several very important and ancient churches. Well, you've seen a lot of those. Some beautiful and most interesting palaces of guilds and old families, and a unique ensemble of medieval streets and lanes, was not cleared or ventilated or drained or otherwise sanitated, but simply swept off the face of the earth, not a trace remaining in the group of commonplace and inappropriate streets and the ostentatious and dreary arcaded square. She's talking about what is now Piazza della Repubblica, which arose on its site. She wrote, "The making of a wide and important thoroughfare from Piazza Vittorio Emanuele to the Ponte Vecchio must suggest to minds bent on improvements the eventual replacing of the old bridge by a new one, more in keeping with the new and practical street abutting on it." Thus she raised the spectre of the demolition of the Ponte Vecchio, one of the city's iconic monuments. And I think about 2 days ago, it was announced that it's to be restored with a 2-year restoration program. She went on, but the flood of modernization spoken of by Signor Carrocci has by no means confined itself to the right bank only of the Arno. And the municipality entertained a few months ago a project presented by the inhabitants of the Oltrarno for the modernization of the most picturesque street on the left bank, the Borgo San Jacopo, with the beautiful early church of the same name, the towers of the Nerli and Marsili families. Such were the projects which were being discussed by the public and by the authorities. Vernon Lee's tone became prophetic. The question arises, what is going to happen in the future? The answer to this will entirely depend upon the greater or lesser power which the Society for the Protection of Old Florence may gain, with the help of foreign sympathizers, over the mind of the people of the town. If the Society can succeed in making the majority of the citizens understand, if not the aesthetic and historic importance of what remains of Old Florence, at all events, the importance thereof as an attraction to foreigners, and therefore as an important source of revenue, then old Florence will be saved. Otherwise, it will simply be pulled down and replaced with modern buildings, as was the case of the center. The municipal authorities are, after all, only the representatives of the public opinion of the moment, and they cannot go against the wishes of and the fads, however unwise, of the townsfolk who elect them. This last point seems particularly well made. Vernon Lee thought that instead of importuning some here today, gone tomorrow politician, one should concentrate one's energies on educating the public. A few days before writing to the Times, Vernon Lee was granted an interview by the mayor of Florence. Nothing could exceed the kindness and courtesy of Marchese Torrigiani in placing before me the plans of new streets and the photographs of the old center, and in answering my long and tiresome interrogation. There was an amusing incident during this interview when they were discussing the possibility of demolishing Borgo San Jacopo. The syndic assured me that there had never been any idea of putting down the side on the river, but it turned out that there was exactly that idea. He called over an employee to back him up, and the employee, far from backing him up, said, "Oh no, they're going to pull the whole lot down." The letter published in the columns of the Thunderer, as the Times liked to be called, had a good effect and helped to create a climate of opinion that prevented further destruction before it was too late. Vernon Lee signed herself a member of the Society for the Protection of Old Florence. I would not have known much about this society had I not been able to purchase from the Libreria Gozzini in Via Ricasoli a copy of its first bulletin, issued in April 1900. The bulletin makes interesting reading. The Associazione per la Difesa di Firenze Antica held its first meeting in May 1898 in Palazzo Corsini, under the president, the Prince Tommaso Corsini, and its vice presidents, the Marquis Dino Uguccioni and the Count Umberto Serristori. Its membership comprised the great and the good of Florence, including many members of the foreign community. Thus, among the 70 soci effettivi, we find the names of the literary critic Guido Biaggi, later to be one of the founders of the British Institute, the painter Augusto Burchi and the architect Antonio Canastrelli, the eminent historian Guido Carocci, Count Piero Caponi, Isidoro del Lungo, who was responsible for the pompous and self-congratulatory inscription set up in Piazza Vittorio Emanuele, now Piazza della Repubblica, Adolf von Hildebrand, the distinguished German sculptor who lived and worked at San Francesco di Paolo below Bellosguardo, Miss Violet Paget, in brackets Vernon Lee, Carlo Placci, who was another future founder of the British Institute, the painter Filadelfo Simi, father of the much-loved art teacher Nerina Simi, Frederick Stibbert, the eccentric Anglo-Florentine collector and proprietor of the Villa Stibbert, where he was visited by Oscar Wilde and Queen Victoria, the Marquis Torrigiani, Mayor of Florence, and Miss Helen Zimmer. Then among the 57 soci aderenti, we recognize the names of the painters Federico Andreotti and Napoleone Cocchetti, Princess Anna Corsini, Signorina Amalia Dupré, the sculptress, Miss Annie Evans, Prince Piero Ginori Conti, Miss Mildred Mansfield, responsible for an ineffably boring book on the Lanfredini entitled A Family of Decent Folk. Janet Ross, the formidable chatelaine of Villa Gherardesca and a prolific author on Florentine and Italian history, as well as of a book about how to cook vegetables. The sculptor Raffaello Romanelli, son of Lorenzo Bartolini's assistant Pasquale Romanelli, the great Macchiaiolo painter Telemaco Signorini, who produced paintings and etchings recording the last years of the ghetto and of the Mercato Vecchio, John Temple Leader, the immensely rich former politician who restored and inhabited the Castello di Vincigliata, where he received Queen Victoria as a guest, the history painter Stefano Ussi, and Carlo Visio. Among the Italian corresponding members are the eminent names of the poet Josue Carducci and the composer Giuseppe Verdi, both senators. The foreign ones include Sidney Colvin. All right, well, that's enough of these for the moment. On 14th December 1898, just one day before Vernon Lee's magnificent letter appeared in the Times, a group of Englishmen sent an open letter to the mayor of Florence, the Marquis Torrigiani, which was published in the Florentine newspaper Fiera Mosca. Its signatories, seen here, included the artist Edward Poynter, president of the Royal Academy and director of the National Gallery, Lawrence Alma-Tadema, the Dutch painter, the last person to become a denizen of the United Kingdom under an archaic law, who was famous for his depictions of the luxury and decadence of the Roman Empire, with languorous figures set in marble halls or against a dazzling Mediterranean sky. George Howard, 9th Earl of Carlisle, who was the last Earl of Carlisle to own Castle Howard. Walter Crane, the socialist and children's book illustrator, who was president of the Royal College of Art. Thomas Sterling Lee, Royal Academician and sculptor specializing in reliefs and portraits. William Blake Robinson, the painter and sculptor, and the painter George Frederick Watts, who as a young man had spent time in Florence as a guest of Lord and Lady Holland in Via dei Serragli. The painter William Holman Hunt, famous for his sickly religious pictures such as The Light of the World, who designed a tomb for his wife in the so-called English cemetery at Piazzale Donatello, and Sidney Colvin at lower right, keeper of prints and drawings in the British Museum. Their letter, composed in stylish and elegant Italian, begins thus: "We are informed that the project to prolong Via Pelliccia from Piazza Vittorio Emanuele to Ponte Vecchio comprehends the imminent destruction of Palazzo Canacci and Palazzo Giandonati and the other old houses in Piazza San Biagio. And the continuance of the project will involve in the destruction not only the church of San Biagio itself, but also the residence of the Arte della Seta and a large part of the Palazzo di Parte Guelfa." Yes, well, I shall make some judicious cuts. Not all of the foreign protesters were English. Heinrich von Geymüller was an eminent Swiss architectural historian who did important scholarly work on San Pietro in Vaticano and on Raphael as an architect. On 28th December 1898, he wrote from Baden-Baden a flowery letter to the Prince Tommaso Corsini, president of the association. Among other things, he said, "It is an error, long committed by me, to believe that the Renaissance of art began with Brunellesco, Donatello, Ghiberti, and the Medici. Its beginning, albeit under pseudo-Gothic guise, was in the century of Dante, of Arnolfo, and of Giotto." Baron von Geymüller continues, "I hope that the ideal collaboration between the association and the municipal authorities will succeed in protecting dear Florence from the boring and thoughtless monotony of the boulevards of Paris Haussmannisé." He apologizes to the prince for his long and imperfect letter, concluding, "I hope for your forgiveness." It will end with the words of Leonardo, "I pensieri si voltano alla speranza." This phrase is usually rendered as "one's thoughts turn towards hope." Well, we've seen a bit of what sort of people the defenders of old Florence were, including the foreigners. What about their enemies, the demolitionists, the progressive modernists? They're not quite so easy to get into focus, for they founded no association for the destruction of old Florence. They lurked in the shadows. Undoubtedly, their prime motivation was financial gain, and several of them had invested deeply in the risanamento. Then I list various schemes. All of these schemes involved razing beautiful old monuments to the ground. We have the impression that these people couldn't have cared less about the splendors and glories of old Florence. Within a decade or so, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti would launch his Manifesto del Futurismo, expressing his contempt and loathing for everything old, especially political and artistic tradition. We want no part of it, the past, we, the young and strong futurists. How extremely disagreeable he looks in the photo on the right. Marinetti glorified war and despised women. My somewhat anachronistic evocation of capitalist speculators is by George Groves. The letter to the mayor of Florence from the 9 English signatories concentrated in particular on the question of Piazza di Parte Guelfa, and the upshot of their action was successful, inasmuch as the various historic buildings there still exist. The damage done to them by the retreating Wehrmacht in 1944 could hardly have been foreseen. Do you all recognize this? Yes. Originally, it was simply the pavis or open space in front of the Romanesque church of Santa Maria sopra Porta, after which Por Santa Maria is named, later known as San Biagio. St. Blaise has always been a popular saint in Tuscany, and many people still go to church to have their throat blessed on the day of his feast, the 3rd of February, because of the story that he saved a child from choking on a fishbone. As he was thought to have been tortured with red-hot combs before being beheaded, he was patron of the wool carders in Florence, and their occupational disease was a sore throat. The origins of the Parte Guelfa, like those of many Florentine institutions, stretch far back in time. Formally instituted by Pope Clement IV in 1261, it was composed of those Florentine knights who on several occasions in the 13th century joined battle with the Ghibelline armies. The 14th century Palazzo Giandonati was one of the buildings threatened with demolition during the Risanamento, since it lay in the direct path of the proposed extension of Via Pellicceria towards Via Cerretani and the Ponte Vecchio. Its interior communicates with the adjacent Palazzo Carnacci. By the time this photograph was taken in the 1860s, its condition had deteriorated considerably. On the right, you can see the unsuitable use made of some of these old buildings. The church of San Biagio has been turned into a fire station, and a large arch has been cut in its wall, labeled Arsenale dei Pompieri, the firefighters' arsenal. Nevertheless, the agitation of our committee seems to have had some effect, and in 1901, the Palazzo was listed as a monumental building of the National Artistic Patrimony, so it was saved. It is now the headquarters of the Calcio in Costume, the violent historic football match played each year on the 24th of June, the feast of St. John the Baptist. Now I've come to the end. Vernon Lee and her friends managed to collect no fewer than 11,000 signatures in less than 3 months. She cannot, of course, take all the credit for personally halting the destruction of old Florence, but her magnificent and disinterested efforts certainly had an enormous effect. For her, the annihilation of the past was as much a moral as a cultural issue. As Vinetta Colby points out in a recent biography, Vernon Lee called herself a sentimental traveler, but her alarm was much more than mere emotional indulgence. It was based on a fundamental concern for the health of what she at various times called the soul, the spirit, or the mind. Her famous letter to the Times and her tireless efforts on behalf of the Society for the Protection of Old Florence are surely not the least of her achievements. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mark. We'll just get some lights on. Okay. Well done, sir. You could have gone on for hours. You obviously had fun putting that one together. Well, indeed. And we'll have to think of another one for your next one. Okay, maybe we should run a competition. What do we want Mark to research next? Is a question you can let me know and I'll share it with him. All right, so as always, we now do the question and answer session and some comments, whatever you want to do. Rules are the same as always. In the room, if you want to speak, please put up your hand and I will bring you the microphone so that our friends on the Zoom can hear you. And if you're on the Zoom, the comments are now properly open again, I think. Should be. So if you want to put your thoughts, questions, comments into the chat, I'll read them out on your behalf. Alternatively, if you're feeling brave, you can just unmute yourself and talk to us and we'll hear you in the room. So does anyone want to kick off with a thought or question over there?
Mark, thank you so much for this beautiful talk and very evocative. But and I wouldn't want to speak for the evil people who wanted to modernize Florence, but I do want to ask you the relationship between that fascinating moment when Florence becomes the capital of a modern new nation state that is, shall we say, divorcing itself from an old ramshackle empire and needs to have a modern capital, and who knows when Rome might actually be possible. So how much of what you're talking about that happens at the end of the century is sort of a product of the planning and the ideas from the 1860s? And how much of it is sort of divorced from that once Rome became the capital?
And you remember that being capital was not a total blessing for Florence. Indeed, the Comune went bankrupt afterwards, or very nearly went bankrupt. But I think once the momentum had started, there was so many vested interests that the process of destruction continued. And as you've seen, a lot of those churches were not demolished until the 1890s.
Very good. Next thought or question. Yeah, Alan.
Yes, there are these nasty people who hid in the dark, but we do know their names and we know the reasons for which, selfish as they might have been. You mentioned, for example, the Marchese Torrigiani, who owned until recently still vast gardens in the center of Florence. Now, he was a mayor and also belonged to one of the most distinguished old families and so on. He didn't hide in the dark. And I was a bit puzzled by
He was on the other side, Alan. He wasn't one of the destroyers. He was one of the people who would like
I noticed that in your list of the people who were, yeah. But as mayor, he
had to do what his
really?
voters wanted us.
We know to this day that the Syndico has limited power. They say they want to get things done and they don't get them done.
Sorry?
Yes, you finished with it, yeah. Next thought or question. I actually have one. Just before we go there, did anyone ever seriously propose to actually demolish the Ponte Vecchio?
Well, I don't know how serious it was, but it was certainly threatened, and she took the threat seriously. I haven't actually found anybody saying that it would be a good idea to dynamite the Ponte Vecchio.
As an activist, it was maybe quite a good play to say even the Ponte Vecchio is under threat. You know, gets people excited. So somebody wanted that.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Mark. That was terrific.
Thank you.
When you're talking about the financial interests that were coming into the city to modernize, at the same time, Vernon Lee and her the friends and whatnot, they're trying to educate and they're trying to raise cultural awareness. But were they also trying to bring financial resources to bear to stop the destruction?
I don't think so much financial resources. They were certainly trying to sway public opinion, and Vernon Lee's great point is that a modernized Florence would not be attractive to tourists. I don't know whether that's true. I think it's probably nonsense. That was her great point.
I'm also very struck by your suggestion that a big letter in the Times was like a turning point, that there was that much influence coming out of London to affect what actually happened in Florence.
Yes, well, I said somewhere that, possibly in one of my suppressed passages, that the English were keen to emphasize that Florence was of universal interest in order not to appear to be, how should I say? What do I mean?
They wanted to not be seen to be interfering foreigners.
To be interfering in the affairs of the new kingdom, as probably they were in some quarters seen that way.
I think this answers Jonathan Mandelbaum's question on the Zoom, which was about the question of the foreign residents campaigning against the destruction of antique Ethiopia.
Yeah.
But we got more in the room. Yes, at the back there.
I guess ironically enough, it was an English or British company that actually demolished the walls and built the Viale. It was a Florence land company. Yes, so it was a British international development company that had a real hand in that, but also the development of Santa Maria Novella, the train station, of course, designed by Brunel. But interesting, I've never heard of anything about wanting to demolish the Ponte Vecchio part, obviously, for World War II, but there was in 1856 a proposal by Martelli to glaze the Ponte Vecchio, to create a kind of series of standardized shop fronts along and to glaze it to turn into a galleria.
Well, that would have been cute and not.
The very destructive scheme that was thankfully never put into effect was to make a wide thoroughfare from Piazza, what is now Piazza della Repubblica, as far as the river. And that, luckily that was scrapped.
That didn't happen. It's also worth noting that around the time we're talking about, late 19th, early 20th century, the population of the Inglese, which is all foreigners, but mostly Brits, was 25 to 30% of the city. So it was not a sort of tiny marginal foreign enclave. It was a significant part of the city. So they had a vote, they had a voice. Somebody else wanted to ask a question over here. Was it gone?
Was about the English contract.
Oh right, yes, yeah. No, so thanks for that. That was I didn't know that. That's a really interesting story. Shame on us. But any more for any more? Shall I see if there's anything more on the Zoom?
I have one very kind of obscure question, but as an American from the state of Maine, that you mentioned she was corresponding to, which a Maine, where did that, her roots in Maine were so local and such, her work was so localized. I'm surprised.
I
Just
see.
asking.
Well, Vernon Lee was very well connected. I don't know exactly how Sarah do it.
Right. Any more for any more? Or are we getting to that time where we have to bid farewell to the Zoomers? Oh no, Edward Cheney is sending something. Your old friend Edward. Many thanks for yet another brilliant talk, caro Marco. To be said for Ruskin's influence on Vernon Lee's conservation campaign of medieval Florence. Regarding the salvation of the Ponte Vecchio, perhaps German conflict in the war and all the other bridges were blown up.
Yes, and yeah, we should pay tribute to Consul, who is commemorated in a small plaque near Ponte Vecchio. I'm not sure. The German consul responsible for saving Ponte Vecchio and the other bridges were dynamited. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, if anyone knows that story, it's nice to have a lecture all about Consul Rolf, because he allegedly had a very good war.
Yeah,
There you go.
David Tutai. Is it?
Yeah, we should get him down to talk about it. Very good. Okay. Any more for any more? No. So Zoomers, you'll have to find your own wine because we're going to have our Rufino. And before we move through for the wine tonight, I need to do my thank yous. Thank you, first of all, very much to Penny Howard, our sponsor for tonight. Thank you, Penny. Very good friend of the Institute. And before I say thank you to Mark, I'll remind you that if you want to buy the book, it's on sale here. I've been reading it. It's pure Mark. If you like his voice, you'll find it in the book. Then really once you've done that, and Robert's family are here to sell the book, then you can, we just can thank Mark very much for another lovely lecture. Thank you, Mark.